Um, all right, thank you. Um, so the barriers around the preventing EV adoption, and this is really speaking specifically to commercial fleets, not necessarily for individual consumers, although some of these same barriers are for consumers as well. So there's a lot of complexity, right? So when you think about a business, right, that has vehicles that it uses to accomplish a task that it has been using for, probably decades. They're used to operating a certain way with internal combustion engine vehicles, and EVs are, a pretty different sort of thing from an operational perspective, right? You have to worry about not just going to stop 5 minutes once a day at a gas station or every couple of days, but worry about like where are you going to charge these vehicles? When are you going to charge them? When do you have time to charge the vehicles when they're not being used? What are the types of charging that makes sense? Also, there's certainly still a lot of uncertainty about like which vehicles make sense and which types of vehicles can be converted effectively to EVs today in the fleet world, right? Not all vehicle classes today have like a really perfect, EV replacement available, right? Especially in the larger kind of medium and heavy duty vehicle classes. So there's a lot of complexity there. The change management piece is really around fear, uncertainty, and there's some skepticism and also just like I would say risk avoidance, right? Or lack of risk tolerance from the people that are operating fleets. They have a job to accomplish from their perspective, right? The people that are managing commercial fleets today, they've got lots of other things they're worried about on a daily basis beyond just like how do I reduce emissions from my fleet, right? They're worried about like safety of the drivers. How do I make sure my vehicles are being maintained properly and keep them on the road? How do I make sure I'm not like blowing my budget in terms of my fleet, et cetera, right? Like they've got plenty of things to worry about. And so when you add on a whole other layer of challenges and complexity around converting their fleet to EVs, for a lot of them, it becomes really pretty overwhelming pretty quickly. And so a lot of folks, there's some folks that are, more tech savvy and more kind of future looking and are excited about EVs as a new technology. But I would say the vast majority of people that, kind of manage commercial fleets on a daily basis, this is just an extra headache, right? It's something else they have to worry about in their job, and that change management can be pretty difficult. And then you've probably seen, in the last 12 months, especially, a lot of negative headlines in the press, more so about EVs, and either they're too expensive, or the sales of EVs are slowing down, or the technology is not ready for prime time, or charging is not very good. Right? There's all sorts of bad press out there, most of which I think is highly exaggerated, honestly, and is actually being pushed a lot of times by like the fossil fuel industry as like a narrative against EVs. But that is out there. That bad press, and so that's another thing that's just causing more skepticism and hesitation in the fleet world. So bottom line here being, there's usually going to be some kind of cost savings, right? If you do this right and you select the right vehicles and the right use case, et cetera, you should be able to save money with EVs as a commercial fleet. So why aren't they doing it? Because of all these barriers, right? That are really slowing these things down. But if you do it properly, right, you can actually turn into a cost savings. It can be a really great thing, and it can also really benefit the driver experience within fleets. So just digging into some of the complexity that I mentioned on the previous slide, there's a whole new ecosystem of vendors, right, and consultants and all those sorts of things, right, that people have to figure out and manage in the EV world. That is totally different ecosystem than what they're used to in the gasoline and diesel powered internal combustion engine world. And there's also much more complexity around like how do you fuel these vehicles, right? It's no longer I just send my vehicles to a gas station every day, or some fleets do have on-site fueling infrastructure, but it's very simple, right? They pull up to the pump and they fuel for whatever, a few minutes. Not the case for fleets with charging, and I'll talk more about that on a later slide. But anyway, just kind of digging into, there's a ton of complexity here. There's a lot of barriers, a lot of challenges. Fleet managers tend to be quickly intimidated by trying to take on this whole transition around EVs. So that's really that whole set of challenges that I just described is really the justification for why my company, Inspiration Mobility, was founded. We were founded about 3.5, 4 years ago, with the vision that all of those different challenges that are holding fleets back can be solved, and ideally can be solved by a single partner under one roof with the right expertise, kind of bringing a lot of different people together with different skill sets. So the idea here with Inspiration is that we have kind of three different lines of business, I guess you could say, or ways that we work with people in the fleet ecosystem. Um, as an EV first fleet management company. So fleet management company is an existing category of company that maybe some of you are aware of. But these are companies that finance and lease vehicles to commercial fleets of all shapes and sizes. They provide often various types of fleet management services like titling and registration of the vehicles, maintenance programs, fuel cards, managing tolls and violations, and all those sorts of things that fleets need when they're on the road. And so Inspiration does all of those things, but with an EV focus. And there's certain things like, worrying about oil changes and other types of maintenance for internal combustion engine powertrains that don't apply in the EV world, right? So we don't have to worry about all those legacy sort of issues around the old powertrain. So that's kind of the vehicle piece of what we do, is really financing and leasing vehicles to fleets and then providing those management services on the road. Then what I personally focus on within the Inspiration team is the middle column here around charging and energy. And that's my background for the last 15 years, is all in kind of clean energy and EV charging. So on that front, I'll talk more about on the next slide, the different flavors of EV charging and what that looks like. But really, the idea is that Inspiration can be a one-stop shop for whatever types of help that fleets need around charging. Inspiration can do it. And like I said, next slide, I'll talk more about that. Um, and the idea is that we can do as little or as much as they want. We can be just an advisor to help them figure out like what is their plan around charging initially. We can actually build the infrastructure for them, or we can even turn it into like a fully financed turnkey solution, right, where they just pay by the kilowatt hour, essentially pay for the fuel like they do today, if that's what they want. Then the other piece of what Inspiration does is around financing and really kind of specialized financing for EVs and fleets specifically. So we have like partnerships with some of the larger EV automakers, right, the OEMs, in order to basically help them with financing vehicles for their customers, their commercial customers, et cetera, helping them with offering kind of turnkey charging solutions, et cetera. And we've also done a lot of work to be able to monetize all of the wonderful tax credits that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act 2 years ago. So there's a ton of complexity around those tax credits, and Inspiration is one of the few companies out there that has really done the work to be able to monetize all of those different tax credits in a fleet context. So getting into charging kind of specifically, there's really 5 different, call it flavors of charging, that we think about that are relevant to fleets. So there's home charging. A lot of fleets, people don't realize, have take-home vehicles, right? They go home with their employees at night. Think like sales reps, think like construction project managers, think plumbers and electricians or cable technicians, right? All those things. So there's a lot of opportunity for doing home charging, which in many cases is kind of the cheapest, fastest, easiest way to get a fleet vehicle charged. There's depot charging, and think of this as like private, behind the fence, controlled facility that the fleet really owns themselves or leases themselves, and so it's just serving their fleet vehicles. Then there's the multi-fleet charging hub. I'll talk more about this concept later in the slides. But the idea is really that you can have usually a fast charging site where that's shared by multiple fleets as a single site. And then temporary and mobile charging there's a lot more solutions. Just in the last like 1 to 2 years, there's been a huge explosion of different temporary and mobile charging vendors and technologies out there. So that is becoming a much more common and viable option for fleets that either don't want to or can't immediately get kind of a permanent charging solution in place at their site, which is great. And then public charging, of course, is the Tesla Supercharger network, EVgo, Electrify America, ChargePoint, all of those public networks that are out there today that can be used by fleet vehicles, right, as kind of usually as like a backstop to some other type of charging solution. Usually public charging is not the main way that fleets charge, but it can be, you know, if needed, if it makes sense. And really one of the key point here is that there's all these different flavors of charging that are relevant for fleets, and it really is not a one size fits all solution. And if you're a fleet of really any size, you're probably going to have to use multiple, you know, charging types of solutions, right, as part of your EV transition. And that's one of the reasons why it becomes so complex, is because they don't understand how to deal with a home charging program versus a depot charging installation versus handling you know, payment for public charging, right, for their fleet vehicles. It gets very complex very quickly. So just diving in a little bit more on the single fleet charging, hopefully, you know, some of the other things like home charging are pretty straightforward. You put in a charger in your garage, and then usually your company will reimburse you, right, for the charging that you do of your fleet vehicle. So that's, you know, fairly straightforward, although a lot of fleets still struggle with that, and we do have a solution to help them with that. But I think when we talk about like impact and like kind of larger scale infrastructure programs, depot charging quickly becomes very impressive and interesting. So I personally, in my previous company before I joined Inspiration, I worked on for about 3.5 years on a major EV deployment with FedEx all over the state of California. And so that's what I'm listing here at the top of the slide. And the pictures you can see here of a FedEx van, fully electric FedEx van with some overhead charging dispensers inside a FedEx distribution center. And then on the right side here, you see all the power cabinets, basically where all the grid power is converted into DC electricity that goes into the vehicle. So this is just one site that we built for FedEx that involved, you know, I think this one was about 50 vehicles were being charged at the 50 vehicles being charged at one site for FedEx. So that total program, which we completed in 2021, 3 years ago, 21 sites, 614 charging ports all over the state of California. That was for FedEx. That was really just a pilot, right? And that was already like a pretty good sized program. We were pretty excited about it at the time. And already you're seeing like Amazon is completely eclipsing that sort of program with more of a full scale rollout. As of, I think it was, you know, about 4 months ago when I checked, Amazon had roughly 120 sites all over the country, all over the US, 17,000 charging ports, meaning, you know, 17,000 vehicles could be charged at once across their full, you know, portfolio of sites. And they're still, that's not even their full fleet, right? That's still just kind of a portion of their overall fleet in the US. So these, you know, kind of fleet deployments can get very big very quickly if we're talking about the really large scale fleets like Amazon, like FedEx, like AT&T or Verizon, right? Some of those really huge fleets that have tens of thousands of vehicles all over the country. So it gets really exciting. And for me, it was really gratifying, honestly, to work on a program like this with FedEx. Learned a lot of good lessons that I'm now taking into my work at Inspiration. So we'll talk a little bit about the multi-fleet charging hub concept here, and I can talk about a specific example that we very recently brought online, actually, a site in, I didn't put it on the slide here because we're not publicly really publicizing the project yet. We're going to do a big press release and stuff in October, but I'll give you a preview. We just built this site in Kansas City and brought it online a few weeks ago. Put in charging capacity. Right now it's 12 fast charging stalls, has the ability to be upgraded or expanded up to 18 stalls in the next couple of years. And it's the primary use case is a taxi fleet, a large, you know, few hundred vehicle taxi fleet in Kansas City that is going to use this as kind of the catalyst for electrifying their entire, you know, taxi fleet over time. So that's really exciting. It is, you know, so it's basically guaranteed fast charging capacity for the taxi fleet as kind of what we call the anchor tenant. If you're familiar with that like term from the real estate world. And then we're also going to be bringing in other secondary kind of local fleets in the area that are also interested in electrifying, but can't or don't want to put in their own, you know, permanent infrastructure on their own sites. So they'll be able to come and use this site the taxi fleet's using as well, alongside the taxi fleet. And then eventually we may also open the site up to you know, the general public as well. But for now, it's going to be fleet focused. It's a great location. It's literally, just outside of downtown Kansas City, on like basically right at the intersection of a bunch of major freeways. Um, the interesting thing about Kansas City is that it is one of the only major cities in the U.S. that has literally zero public fast chargers in downtown. The closest site for fast charging is about 12 miles away, out in the suburbs. And so this is really going to be the first real site in downtown Kansas City that's going to be able to offer true fast charging. So that's exciting. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the concept from a business model perspective is that fleets will be able to basically have a subscription or a membership to this this site. That PowerPoint is our kind of brand name for these fast charging multi-fleet hubs. So for the PowerPoint, the fleets will be able to sign a contract that says, okay, over the next year or whatever, I'm going to use this many kilowatt hours per vehicle per month, and get a discounted price in exchange for giving us that sort of minimum commitment. And then they'll have, again, like guaranteed fast charging access for their fleet vehicles that they didn't have to build themselves. They didn't have to do anything except sign a contract with us. And so the idea here is that this should be able to help accelerate adoption of EVs within the region, right? By giving kind of like an easy button for fleets that are, maybe they're just starting to dip their toe in the water of transitioning their fleet to EVs. They're not quite ready to invest in like, depot charging at their own site. So this is a good way to get started. Or for fleets like a taxi fleet that need fast charging capacity that can't sit overnight on a slower level 2 charger. Maybe this is their primary charging method, for the foreseeable future. So anyway, we're pretty excited about this project in Kansas City. We've got many other similar PowerPoint projects and sites in development right now in other cities as well. So really looking forward to basically replicating this model and using this as a way to kind of drive EV adoption in lots of different cities. And I think the other important point to make is that this site was not did not have any significant amount of financial incentives or rebates or grants. The site is basically being financed through the contract with the taxi fleet, and their commitment to using the site is what allowed us to basically build the project. So we're not dependent on like a lot of charging projects today on grants and incentives, although those are great and they should be offered, right, especially for commercial fleets. All right, and then just in terms of like impact of this project in Kansas City, which again, these same bullet points could apply to any other city where we do a PowerPoint. Basically, there's this highly visible taxi fleet that people see they see those taxi vehicles driving around the city all the time, right? And seeing those vehicles being converted to EVs helps people, I think, get comfortable with the technology. That it's reliable, it's good enough for a commercial fleet, so it's probably good enough for me as an individual consumer, right, to get an EV for my own needs. So that's one good impact. Like I said before, it's giving kind of an easy button to local commercial fleets, right, that are thinking about EVs, and they can get a dedicated fast charging spot for their fleet vehicles, and they can also, through inspiration, get financing and get kind of an easy button for the vehicle side of that deployment as well. Like I said, we can help them with all of the financing the vehicles and all the on-road kind of fleet management services. And then, like I said, also there's this in Kansas City and in many other cities still today, especially like smaller second-tier cities in the U.S. There's not a lot of public fast charging, kind of in the core of the city, and so this is really going to address that need as well. All right, last thing I'll touch on is, in addition to kind of like all the different flavors of charging I talked about, there's a lot of kind of new, interesting technologies on kind of the cutting edge of what's going on in fleet electrification and EV charging in general, that I just want to mention, because I'm sure a lot of people here are interested in these other types of technologies. So today, I would say we as a company, we're very committed to sustainability, right? That's really our whole reason for existing as a company. So we're very interested in minimizing emissions or zeroing out emissions from EV charging. I think the challenge that we find is that in at least most of the sites that we have to date looked at, solar and battery storage, which people I think often think about like, yeah, why wouldn't you have on-site solar and battery storage, as part of your EV charging project. It's a great idea, but in many cases, it just doesn't pencil out economically, unfortunately. Especially in places like Kansas City, where electricity prices are not crazy high, um, and the demand charges aren't super high, et cetera. So that's where battery storage, can often make a lot of sense. So we're certainly always on the lookout, and every site we look at, we always, assess to see whether solar and battery storage, are viable. But we haven't done a lot of that to date, but we're expecting that'll happen more and more. And as we get into kind of like the microgrid world, and as we work with more fleets that have higher resiliency and reliability requirements, where they really can't afford to, have their charging go down if there's a grid outage, we will certainly be doing a lot more of these types of microgrid projects. But for now, I would say um, most fleet charging deployments are not going to do a full microgrid, right? It just doesn't make economic sense, and they don't have that sort of need today. But we'll definitely increase in the future. Um, People may hear about wireless charging. It's a really cool technology. We're all familiar with it on our phones now, so it's very similar for your car. You just pull your car over a pad that sits on the ground, and then there's a pad on the bottom of the car, and they sync up and transfer the power wirelessly. It's pretty neat. Really great for, obviously, for autonomous vehicles as we get more of those on the road, et cetera. Technology is still not, I would say, at like full commercial scale, but definitely interesting. And I personally think it's going to be a great future. Maybe 10 years from now, at some point, it probably will be the standard, but we're just not quite there yet today. People often, think about bidirectional charging, meaning vehicle to grid, could be vehicle to home, vehicle to building, vehicle to other vehicle, right? A lot of things that we can do when we have all this electricity in the vehicle battery, and we can use it for other purposes. Um, I think the technology is pretty much there. It's really just a policy and regulatory issue at this point of being able to allow people to get compensated, and allowing utilities allowing people to do this kind of at scale. I think the first use case will be vehicle to home that really takes off, and that's already getting publicized by Ford with their F-150 Lightning that can do charging of your home, et cetera. And they get a lot of good press for that. So that's going to be becoming more common. Full vehicle to grid, where you're actually discharging from vehicle battery back into the grid and getting paid for it by the utility. That still is very much in kind of pilot phase, but it is very interesting, and again will be important in the future as we get more EVs, and we need more kind of flexible load on the grid in order to manage kind of variable wind and solar output. That's going to be a great tool to have in the toolkit, and is definitely being piloted in a lot of places today. Um, for commercial fleet charging installations, um, offsite renewables through renewable energy credits or virtual power purchase agreements, et cetera, can be a great idea. Certainly makes a lot of sense. And I would say, most fleets, because they're just at the very beginning of this journey. They're just getting comfortable with EVs and with charging as a technology. And is it going to work for my use case? Is it going to be reliable, et cetera? So they're not thinking too much in most cases about how to have like truly zero emissions for their fleet with EVs. But there are certainly a few fleets out there that are thinking about it, and I think at some point in the future, call it within the next 5 years, I'm sure it'll become something that's just expected that if you're electrifying your fleet, that you will have some sort of way to kind of zero out those emissions through credits or other methods, or virtual PPAs, or on-site solar, if that makes sense. So that's exciting. And then virtual power plants, there's been quite a bit of talk about this recently, I would say, in kind of the energy press, which is great. And really, this is an exciting way for EVs and EV charging to really become part of the electricity markets, right? And be able to either reduce demand at the right times, or send energy back to the grid with bidirectional charging, if that's allowed in the jurisdiction. And so that is really, again, an exciting way. It's still, again, mostly at the pilot stage right now in a few different markets, but definitely expecting that that'll be a great way to basically an additional revenue stream for EV owners, first of all, but also a great way, again, to like help out the grid and make sure that we can manage the grid effectively with high renewables in the future. So want to make sure we didn't forget about those kind of interesting new technologies that are on the horizon. So last slide here. This is really kind of thinking about like, how do we get to a fully electrified or almost fully electrified zero emissions kind of on-road transportation system. um, I think there's three different pieces that I'm listing here. One is making sure that we have the right vehicles to be able to meet all the different needs and all the different market segments that are, first of all affordable, but also compelling and have all the right features and capabilities, et cetera, that people need, both for consumers and for fleets. We need to have the right charging solution mix, right? That is, of course, cost effective, is reliable, but is also clean. As I was just saying, we want to make sure that we can have renewable energy powering all of that charging as much as possible. And then, so the other piece that I think, again, is probably not as well appreciated outside of kind of the fleet industry is that uh, even if you have the right vehicles and the right charging technologies available and products available, you still need a way to bring it all together and make the transition process easy, cost effective, and just not scary, right? Like right now, it's very scary for a fleet manager to take on the task of electrifying their fleet. And so that's again really where inspiration mobility, our whole reason for being, is this third piece, right? Is how to make that transition process as easy and profitable as possible. And we all need to do the same thing for consumers, right? Better education, all those sorts of things, right? For consumers as well as for the fleets. And then I just wanted to highlight in the graph in the top right corner here, people may have heard about Norway being kind of the poster child now. They are by far and away the most electrified country in the world in terms of vehicles. I think they're, as of last month, they were at about 95% of new sales were EVs, which is super exciting that we at least have an example to show that it is possible for for countries to get to that point. And you can just see how it's basically just crossing the curve here, right, where the diesel and petrol slash gasoline vehicles going down, EVs going up, and they crossed about what 4 years ago at least, in terms of the mix. So they're leading the way. Norway's leading the way. They're showing that it's possible, and I think the rest of us just need to take those lessons from countries like Norway, and also, like I said, just keep working on all these three pillars here that I'm showing on the slide to get to that transportation future with zero emissions. So with that, I will call it the end of the presentation. Here's my email if you want to get in touch. If you want to learn about inspiration, you can go to our website. And always happy. Like I said, I'm really involved as a mentor with Terra.do, and I've talked with a lot of different people through the program. So always happy to talk with people and offer advice, do whatever I can to help. We need as many people, smart, capable, passionate people as we can get in working on this problem. So I'm always happy to do whatever I can to help people break into the industry. So I will. I guess we can go to Q&A.
Perfect. There are quite a lot of questions out here. I think the first question is for whoever is going to unmute themselves and asking the question. Probably Scott. You had multiple questions.
Yeah, I had 3 questions in the chat. Do you want me to ask all 3 or just one of them for now?
Probably start with one.
Okay. So, Dan, you mentioned earlier that people are like, there's a lot of non-university about charging, with. So Tesla was sued recently and told that they had to make their network available to all brands. Do you think that's going to impact on that issue?
Yeah, well, so in Europe, Tesla was required by regulation to use the universal connector, basically that any vehicle could use, right, or any EV could use for fast charging. In the US, that was not done. What happened in the US was that this was about a year and a half ago now, essentially Ford was the first one that decided, because the Tesla supercharger public network was so good and so much bigger than any of the other public charging networks in the US, they decided they were actually going to switch from using what's called the CCS connector, which is the universal connector that everybody besides Tesla has been using, they decided to switch from the CCS to the Tesla connector, right, or charging port, so they could get access to the supercharger network. And then right after Ford did that, GM announced they were going to do the same thing. And then basically all the other major automakers over the next 6 months or so during the course of 2023 made the same decision. And so what has happened now is that in Europe, basically Tesla was already on the CCS standard. In the US now, everybody has switched to the Tesla standard. So starting next year, most of the major automakers are going to be producing their new EVs with the Tesla charging port built in, native. But for all the vehicles that have been manufactured up through this year, they're going to have to start using adapters if they want to use the Tesla network. So we're going to be in a bit of a situation for a while where there's going to be a lot of people using a lot of adapters to kind of go between the other public networks and the Tesla network. But I think it's generally a good thing that we are now basically standardized on a single connector type in the US, even though it's different than Europe. Sorry, does that answer your question? I think so. The impact of that, I think, will be if in the short term, it's extra confusion and kind of annoyance to use adapters for people that are driving EVs. But in the long term, it's very good for simplifying the user experience, et cetera, for charging.
So, Dan, we've kind of shot over on the time. So if you're game for a couple more questions, we can do that, or else we can.
Yeah. I can hang on for a few minutes, sure.
All right. Probably Kate, you had one question early on. Sure, she's here.
Hi there. This is the right place, right? Hi, Dan. Thank you for the presentation. It's really great. I was interested in hearing about the conversations that are happening around the power grid, being able to scale up to the higher demand in electric. How's that going?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a perennial question that people have, like, can the grid handle all these EVs, right, charging? So there's a couple pieces to the answer for that one. At the macro level, like at the level of like the transmission network, the high voltage transmission network, we do need more transmission capacity. We need to build more utility scale renewables just in general, not only for EVs, but also for data centers and other loads on the grid that are increasing right now. So that work does need to be done. But for EV charging specifically, the main constraints or issues at the moment are typically at the very localized distribution network level, right? So if you put in a charger at your house in your garage, not going to be a problem, right? But if you and every single other neighbor on your block puts in a higher power kind of charger in your garage, eventually you're going to overwhelm the capacity of that utility distribution transformer in your neighborhood, and so the utility will eventually have to upgrade, et cetera, right? So that's a constraint from the kind of on the residential side. On the commercial side, if for when we as Inspiration or any other company is building like a fast charging site like the one we just did in Kansas City, we 99% of the time have to build a whole new utility service, right? Basically like new transformer, new meter, right? New connection to the distribution circuit, et cetera, right? Like, so that's usually and so that takes time and energy and cost, right? To build a new utility service for that site. And then if you have a lot of that load growth happening all again on the same circuit within the distribution network, that can be a major problem for the utility, right? In terms of needing to upgrade their capacity, right? And so that is another issue where, like, especially if you got like a large, call it like transit bus depot, where we've got 10 megawatts of charging load, that's a major grid upgrade essentially that needs to happen. And so there are places where that is going to be a constraint and an issue for the grid, but I think it's certainly something that can be managed. It's just a question of how do we speed up all of those processes around getting that grid capacity in place so that we don't slow down EV adoption because of grid constraints, right? And I think right now, at least in California, there are some places where grid constraints are actually slowing down EV adoption to some extent, but in the rest of the US, I don't think that's really too much of an issue yet. But as we get to higher and higher EV penetration levels, it could become a constraint. And it's something that the utility industry is working on and needs to do much, much better at in terms of streamlining that whole process.
Cool. So, Dan, just one last question. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right. I see Hitesh here. He has a question. Hitesh, would you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, I had two or three of them.
Let's take to one,
Thank you
please.
again. Yes, yes. Dan, I've already sent you a LinkedIn request. It'd be great to connect and discuss this topic further. But
Sure.
piggybacking on what you left off at the end there, I was just recently looking at the EIA website and looking at the grid statistics in general for the United States. 43% is made with 43% of our grid electricity that comes to houses and commercial usage comes from burning natural gas. When you guys look at inspiration and when you guys kind of consider locations where you want to put the grids or put the charging station and the infrastructure, how much of a scope 3, scope 2 type of a discussion goes on in the planning phase where, is it really a good idea to put this station here versus some other facility? Or do you have the choice of subscribing to a certain grid provider versus the other ones that may have a different portfolio of where they're getting the source of the electricity that they're generating from?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. So, yeah, it depends on which, at least within the, I'm talking about, again, because Inspiration is a US focused company. So I'll just talk about the US for now. So within the US, as you may know, right, there's regulated and deregulated markets. So in regulated markets, you have no choice. If you are in, like where I live in California, I have one utility and I don't have any choice, right? Like they serve me and I have to take what they give. In terms of like the sources of their electricity. If you're in a deregulated market like Texas or certain parts of the East Coast, et cetera, you have retail choice, right? Meaning you can actually say like, I want to get on a 100% renewable energy plan, right? And pay, in some cases, pay extra for that. So if for commercial kind of fleet charging, it all depends on our customer, right? Our fleet customer will dictate what they want. And so if they have a preference, and again, if there is an extra cost, that's a choice they need to make, right? Like, do they want to pay extra if there is an extra cost, right? To have 100% renewable energy power in their vehicles.
And the pricing is predetermined?
Yeah. I mean, generally, right. So if you're in the US, generally, right, you're going to be either paying like the regulated utility rates, right, standard, or if you're in a deregulated market, you will have some retail choice, meaning like, yeah, you can probably find a cheaper plan, but that may or may not be the plan that is 100% renewables, right? However, I will say that, as I kind of touched on earlier, most commercial fleets, I mean, like, this is not even on their radar, right? Like they like, and I guess the other point I would make is that even in places where there is a high proportion of coal or natural gas electricity generation, it's still better to drive an EV than to drive a gasoline vehicle, right? So they're still going to be reducing emissions, right? Even if they're on a fossil fuel heavy grid. But that grid's just going to get cleaner over time, meaning like once they get EVs, like those EVs are going to get cleaner year over year as the grid cleans up. So that's always good. The other point I would make is that right now in the commercial fleet world, we don't usually have the luxury of siting charging in a place with a cleaner grid. We are almost always completely dictated by where we have a customer that is actually adopting EVs and putting them on the road and needs charging, right? That is like almost always the constraint or the factor that determines location is always based on where is there actually a customer.
Where the demand is. Gotcha. Makes sense.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan. If I let this go on for a couple more minutes, I'm pretty sure Keithy's gonna get me. Thank you everyone for coming over, and thank you very much, Dan, for that insightful session. Loved it. Firstly, learned a lot. So I'm not in America, but then I've learned a lot. So thank you very much. See you soon again. Good morning, good night, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you. Bye bye.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you joining. Great to talk to you all.